I have been a solicitor for 31 years, and in that time I have drawn up wills for earls, managed trusts for marquises, and witnessed the signing of more marriage settlements than I can count. I have seen money move through families like water through cracked stone, quietly, relentlessly, leaving some rooms flooded and others entirely dry. I thought I had seen every variety of English secret. I had not. The secret I am about to describe did not live in a deed box or a sealed vault. It lived in a laundry room. It lived in a young woman's hands, red from the ringing water, steadily folding linen at 6:30 every morning as if the world owed her nothing and she expected nothing back from it. Her name, as far as Haverston Hall was concerned, was Myra Denny. She had been on staff 3 years when I arrived in the autumn of 1834 to help the Duke settle a matter of tenant rents. By the time I left 4 weeks later, I had witnessed something I would set down in no legal document, because some things are too large for paper, and some truths are better told than filed. Let me begin with the Duke. Aldrich Vane, Duke of Haverston, was the sort of man about whom rumors accumulated the way snow gathers on a north-facing roof, steadily, silently, until the weight of them became the first thing anyone noticed. He was feared in 3 counties, I am told, though I never quite understood it. He was cold, certainly. He spoke little and watched much. His staff moved around him with the particular care of people who know that a careless word in the wrong moment costs something irretrievable. He was not cruel. He was simply exact. Everything at Haverston Hall ran to his standard. The accounts balanced to the penny, the grounds were trimmed to the inch, and every letter he received was answered within a day. He was, in short, a man of exacting conscience, and it was that conscience, that refusal to let an unresolved thing stay unresolved, that had set him on a search stretching back 3 years before I ever arrived. His friend, Lord Caspar Aldenver, had died of fever in the spring of 1831, 3 weeks after writing a letter that the Duke kept in his library desk under lock and key. I had never read it was not my business, but I knew of its existence because the Duke had referenced it obliquely every time the subject of the Aldenver estate arose. They had been friends since Eton, those two, Caspar quick and warm and reckless, the Duke measured and steady, the kind of friendship in which each man provided what the other lacked. When Caspar died, the Duke had stood at his grave and said nothing, which I was told was more affecting than any speech could have been. Then he had gone home and begun searching. Caspar's line was extinct, officially. His wife had died in childbed. His infant daughter, documented in the parish register of a small village called Thornwick, 20 miles east of the Hall, had disappeared shortly after. The midwife swore she had delivered a living girl. The house records showed a child had been registered. And then the trail went cold, the way trails go cold when money is involved and someone has a reason to lose them. The estate solicitor at the time, a man named Forster, had been appointed by a distant cousin of the Aldenvers who stood to inherit if no direct heir could be confirmed. There had never been a formal inquiry. The cousin had died in 1826. Forster had died the same year. Whatever arrangement had been made with the infant, the paper trail had been buried with both of them. The Duke had spent 3 years and a considerable sum in the effort to find Caspar's daughter. Parish records, church registers. Household ledgers from every estate within a 20-mile radius. Midwife's testimony obtained at last from an elderly woman in Thornwick who remembered the birth vividly, but could say no more about what had become of the child than that a man in a good coat had come and taken her away a fortnight later, and she had been told it was arranged. If he found the girl, the Duke had told me once, very quietly, he would restore her name and her inheritance, such as remained of it, because Caspar had been his closest friend since boyhood, and because the Duke of Haverston did not leave a thing undone. He had found nothing. 18 months of searching had produced not a single name he could confirm, not a single face he could match to the age and the date and the village. By the time I arrived that autumn, the search had gone quiet but not cold. He was still looking. He simply did not know where else to look. I noticed Myra Denny on my second morning at the Hall. I was up before the household, an old habit, and I had come down to the kitchen passage in search of hot water for my pen ink which had thickened overnight in the cold. She was already in the laundry room, working by lamplight. The door stood half open. She did not see me. She was folding a length of white linen with the unhurried precision of someone for whom a task done well is its own satisfaction, not performance, not hurry, simply careful attention. Her dark hair was pinned back simply. Her dress was a plain gray wool, worn at the cuffs. She was perhaps 22 or 23, with a face that was, in that early lamplight, quietly remarkable, not a face that called attention to itself, but the sort of face that, once you had truly looked at it, stayed with you. I did not stare. I am not a man who stares. I collected my hot water from the kitchen, made 2 doors down, and went back to my room and thought nothing more of it until dinner, when I happened to mention to the Duke's butler, old Goss, that his laundry staff seemed particularly efficient. "Miss Denny," Goss said, with the approving brevity of a man who has supervised a great many household staff and knows quality when he sees it. 3 years with us. Never a complaint, never a late morning, never a mislaid sheet. "Where does she come from?" I asked, more out of conversational politeness than curiosity. "Thornwick," said Goss. "A village east of here. Her people are gone, parents both dead when she was an infant, I believe. She was raised by a seamstress, came to us at 19. I noted this because I note most things. I am a solicitor. We are trained to record and to file. I did not yet understand what I had just filed. The Duke and I were deep in the tenant accounts that week, and I saw little of the household staff beyond mealtimes. But I became aware, in the way one becomes aware of a repeated sound in a large room, that the Duke was never entirely unaware of where Myra Denny was. He did not watch her. He was not so obvious as that. But when she passed the library door with a stack of linens, his gaze followed the sound for a half-second before returning to the ledger. When she was mentioned in Goss's household report, the Duke's pen paused. When she corrected a footman in the corridor below the library window, clearly, calmly, about the method of loading the service cart in a way that would prevent a second spilled tray that week. The Duke sat very still for a moment before resuming his annotation of the rent roll. I noticed these small stoppages the way you notice a clock that has been set 1 minute fast, only if you are paying attention, and I was. I did not ask him about it. It was not my place, and he would not have answered in any case. But I began to think that whatever he felt for this young woman in gray wool had been building in him quietly for a long time. The way a word you have been searching for will suddenly appear in your mind only after you have stopped actively hunting it. The incident that changed everything occurred on the evening of the 17th of October, in the west corridor of the servants' wing. There was a small chimney fire, minor, quickly extinguished. No damage beyond scorched plaster and a ruined curtain. But in the confusion of opening windows and routing smoke and hurrying the kitchen staff toward the yard, the back passages of the house became a general disorder of coughing footmen and shouted instructions, and the Duke, making his way along the west corridor to assess the damage at the far end, turned through the wrong door. I was 6 feet behind him when it happened. I saw his hand on the door handle. I saw the door swing inward. I had a single moment's view of a small dressing room with a hip bath before the Duke stepped back and pulled the door firmly shut. He had his back to me. He stood very still. I could not see his face, but I saw the set of his shoulders chain, a shift so slight that most men would have missed it, but I had known him 8 years and I did not miss it. It was not the stillness of embarrassment. A man embarrassed by a wrong door retreats at once and continues moving. The Duke stood in the corridor with the door closed behind him, and he did not move for a count of perhaps 4 seconds. Then he turned and walked back past me toward the main hall. His expression was composed. He said in the even voice he used for everything, "The fire is contained. Goss will see to the rest." And he continued down the corridor. I said nothing, but I had seen, in the half-second the door stood open, that Myra Denny had been at the bath, and I had seen, in the half-second before the Duke pulled the door shut, the quality of his stillness. Not a man embarrassed and retreating, a man arrested by something he had not expected to see. That night the Duke did not join me in the library as was his custom. I sat with the tenant files until 10 o'clock, and when I passed the library on my way to bed, I saw lamplight under the door. Not the broad, working lamplight of a man doing accounts. A single lamp, and the sound of very little movement. The sound of a man sitting with a piece of paper for a long time. He had unlocked the letter. He said nothing to me the next morning, or the morning after. He was his usual precise, courteous self, asking about the progress of the rent calculations, and commenting on a discrepancy in the Thornwick parcel accounts that I should have caught 2 days before. Thornwick. He said the name without any visible weight. I only noticed it because I had heard it once before from Goss in the context of Myra Denny's origin. On the 3rd morning, he asked me, very quietly, as we sat with coffee before the fire, whether I happen to know the standard approach for verifying an abandoned child's birth registration against a current servant's records. I set down my cup. I looked at him. He was looking at the fire. "What exactly," I said carefully, "are you verifying?" He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Casper's girl had a birthmark. His wife noted it in a letter to her sister, written 6 days after the birth. A crescent shape with a smaller mark beside it. His wife called it a star. Left shoulder blade." I did not speak. "I need to know," he said, still looking at the fire, "whether a current member of this household who is approximately the right age and who was raised in Thornwick and who arrived at this estate with no family of her own might be Casper's daughter." "You saw the mark," I said. "I saw the mark," he said. The silence in the room was of the particular quality that descends when two men of good judgment have each arrived, by different routes, at the same large and unavoidable conclusion. "Tell me what you need," I said. We began that morning, and we worked with absolute discretion for 12 days. The parish register at Thornwick was our first stop. I wrote out myself, with a covering story about estate boundary verification that was plausible enough to attract no comment. The register listed, in the copperplate hand of an old vicar, the birth of a female child to Lord and Lady Aldenver on the 14th of March, 1812. Below that, in a different hand, 2 weeks later, infant placed in care of one Margaret Denny, seamstress of Thornwick Village at the instruction of the estate solicitor, pending settlement of the estate. No further record. The estate solicitor of record was the same Forster, long dead. His files were in a box in a Shrewsbury archive. I sent for them by express. While I waited, the Duke did something I had not expected of him. He spoke to Myra Denny. Not about any of this. He was not a man to raise a hope before he could confirm it. But I observed on 2 separate evenings that he had occasion to pass through the hall when she was carrying linens to the east rooms, and on both occasions he stopped and asked her something brief and seemingly inconsequential. Once about whether a certain window latch in the upper hall was sticking, once about whether the damp patch in the south corridor had worsened. Small household questions. The sort that a duke asks a butler, not a laundress. She answered him with the calm, unadorned directness that I had already come to recognize as her particular manner. No curtsy more than necessary. No fluster. No bid for his attention beyond the question he had asked. She told him the window latch had needed a shim since February, and that whoever maintained the window hardware wanted speaking to. She told him the damp patch had worsened, and that she had placed a report in Goss's box about it 3 weeks prior, and perhaps Goss's box wanted emptying. The Duke listened to both answers with an expression I could not read from where I stood. He thanked her and continued on his way. But I noticed, again, that pause, that half-second of absolute stillness before he moved. He was not a man who revealed himself easily, but I had known him 8 years. I could read the shape of a feeling in him even when he would not name it. He was afraid, not of her. Not of what he had seen, or what the birthmark might mean in legal terms. He was afraid of something that no solicitor's document could resolve, the possibility that what he felt for this woman in gray wool, this laundress who answered him without a single unnecessary word and filed correct reports through the proper channels, had grown in him over 3 years without his consciously noticing it. The way ivy grows across stone until one morning you look, and the stone is entirely gone. A man who prides himself on noticing everything does not enjoy the discovery that the most important thing has been happening directly under his watch. There was another dimension to his fear, and I was aware of it even though he never named it. If the evidence held, if Myra Denny was indeed Casper Aldenver's daughter, then the Duke's feelings for her were a complication he had not asked for and had not arranged. He had not set out to search for a woman to love. He had set out to fulfill a vow to a dead friend. And if those two purposes had quietly arrived at the same person, that convergence raised a question he could not, as a man of complete integrity, ignore. That when the restoration came, when he named her and gave her back her birthright and returned what had been taken from her as an infant, any gesture he made toward her after that could be mistaken by her, by anyone watching, as the action of a man who had given her something in order to receive something in return. The appearance of obligation. The ugliest kind of debt. He would not have that. I knew him well enough to know he would not have it at any price. Whatever he felt, it would be declared after the duty was done, plainly and without the shadow of the gift over it, and she would be free to refuse him without it costing her a single thing. It is not a small thing to love someone like that. Most men are not equal to it. The Forster files arrived on the 29th of October. I spent 4 hours with them at the library table while the Duke sat across from me and read nothing. He simply waited, in the particular way of a man who has been waiting for 3 years and is not going to let impatience make itself visible now. The relevant document was on page 11 of an undated bundle. A receipt of all things, a receipt, signed by one Margaret Denny, for a sum of £40 per annum, to be paid from the Aldenver estate surplus for the maintenance and raising of the infant daughter. The receipt described the child as bearing, on her left shoulder blade, a birthmark in the form of a crescent with an adjacent small mark, noted for purposes of future identification. It was signed by Margaret Denny and witnessed by 2 names I traced to the Thornwick vestry records without difficulty. Beside the receipt was a brief memorandum in Forster's hand: child healthy, placed securely, arrangement not to be disturbed unless direct heir to title can be confirmed by surviving peer. I set the page on the table between us. The Duke looked at it for a very long time. Then he stood and he walked to the window, and he stood with his back to me for a while that was neither short nor long, but simply what it was. "Her name," he said, "is Aldenver." "Yes," I said. "Caspar's daughter." "Yes." He said nothing else for a moment. Then, "What is required to restore her formally?" I told him. A petition to the College of Arms was possible but slow. What was more immediately powerful, and what the Duke wanted, I understood now, was not slow but right, was a signed affidavit from an existing peer acknowledging her lineage, combined with the documentary chain we had assembled, presented before witnesses at a formal occasion. It would not instantly restore an estate. There were legal complications with the Aldenver inheritance that would take months to untangle, but it would restore her name, her status, the dignity that had been quietly buried alongside her mother's death and her father's fever, and a solicitor's quiet management of an inconvenient infant. "Arrange it," said the Duke. Then he was quiet for a moment more. "And Pharaoh, she is not to know until I am standing in front of her with the full account, not a hint. I will not have her hoping for something I cannot yet give her with complete certainty." "Of course," I said. I arranged it. The gathering was not a ball or a reception. It was not the Duke's way to make a spectacle of something this serious. He invited his closest neighbors, 3 local magistrates, the Thornwick vicar, 2 members of the county gentry whose families had known the Aldenvers, and his own household staff. 28 people in total, assembled in the Great Hall at Haverston on the evening of the 4th of November, with no stated purpose beyond that the Duke wished to address them on a matter of county record. The kind of gathering that in this part of England one attends without asking too many questions, because the Duke of Haverston does not call gatherings casually, and whatever he intends to say is worth hearing. The Great Hall itself was lit by candles, dozens of them, in the iron chandeliers overhead and in the sconces along the stone walls, and in that amber light the room had the quality of a stage, which I suspected was not entirely accidental. The Duke arranged things with purpose. If this moment was to be remembered correctly by the right people with the appropriate gravity, then it required a setting that would hold it. He was not theatrical by nature, but he understood the power of occasion. Myra did not know why she had been asked to be present. Goss had told her the Duke required all household staff to attend. A fire drill protocol review was the cover story, and she came into the great hall in her gray wool dress and her neat pinned hair with the alert, unstarted composure that was simply her. She stood among the other staff at the back of the room, not apart from them, not distinguishing herself. She had spent 3 years learning to stand among them, and she did it as she did everything, without comment, without performance, simply present. I watched her from my position near the front, where I had arranged the documents on a small reading table. The Duke stood at the head of the hall. He did not have notes. He had never needed notes for anything in his life. He told them briefly and precisely about Lord Caspar Aldenver, about Caspar's wife and the birth of a daughter in the spring of 1812, about the disappearance of that daughter, the search he had conducted over 3 years, and the conclusion to which the evidence had irrefutably led him. He did not dramatize it. He simply laid it down, document by document, fact by fact, in the way that truth, when it is complete and carefully assembled, does not need embellishment. I watched Myra's face across the room. She was absolutely still. She had gone pale with the first mention of Thornwick. By the second, she had gone the particular colorless shade of someone who is reconstructing their entire history in real time and finding that the floor has shifted under them. She did not cry. She did not move. She stood with her hands clasped in front of her, and she listened to every word the Duke said with the focused, undeflected attention she gave to everything, as if she were receiving information rather than a life. When he finished the factual account, he called me forward. I read the relevant passages from the Forster file. I read the parish register entry. I read Margaret Denny's receipt with the description of the birthmark. Around the room, I heard several small sounds, an intake of breath from one of the housemaids, a quiet word between two of the gentry, and I was conscious throughout of Myra's stillness at the back of the room, that quality of a person who has learned, by long practice, to absorb difficult things without falling apart. Then the Duke turned and looked at her directly for the first time since the gathering had begun. "Miss Denny," he said, in the carrying quiet of a man who speaks rarely and means everything he says, "the record is complete. You are the Honorable Miss Aldenver, daughter of Lord Caspar Aldenver, and I name you so before these witnesses." The room was very quiet. She looked at him for a long moment. I was close enough to see her throat move. Then she said, with only the very smallest tremor in her voice, "You searched 3 years." "Yes," said the Duke. "Because he was your friend." "Because he was my friend," said the Duke, "and because you are his daughter, and because it was the right thing to do." She absorbed this. Around the room, I could see the constrained expressions of people who were witnessing something extraordinary and were not entirely sure what the appropriate response was, whether to applaud, or to remain silent, or to do something useful in between. The magistrates were very carefully looking at their hands. The vicar was looking at the ceiling. 2 of the housemaids were weeping without permission. It was Myra who moved first. She crossed the hall, which took perhaps 8 seconds and felt like considerably longer, and she stopped in front of the Duke, close enough that only he and I and the people nearest to them could hear what she said next. "I have been in your house 3 years, she said, "and you never gave me reason to think I was anything other than a laundress." "You are not merely a laundress," said the Duke. "You never were." "That is not what I mean," said Myra, and there was something in her voice then, a careful, undefended precision, that was, I realized, a great deal like his own. "I mean that you treated me exactly as you treat everyone else in this house, with complete fairness, with attention I did not expect and never asked for. You answered my report about the damp patch." "It was a sensible report," said the Duke. "After 3 weeks in Goss's box," she said. "Goss's box," said the Duke, with a gravity that suggested he had already addressed this matter privately, "has been attended to." It was not a declaration. It was not a swept-floor ballroom with 100 witnesses gasping. It was 2 people standing in a candlelit hall, speaking with extraordinary precision about a window latch and a damp patch and a box that wanted emptying, and somehow meaning something entirely else. But I have told you I am a solicitor. I know the weight of words that carry more than their face value. I know when a contract has been formed that no one has signed yet. He spoke to her afterward in the library with the door open. It would not have been proper otherwise, and he was a man who understood propriety not as performance, but as the architecture within which trust is built. I stood in the corridor and did not listen, which is to say, I remained close enough to ensure the proprieties held without intruding on what was said. I heard very little. I heard him say her name, her true name, Aldenver, with a careful, practiced quality, as if he were learning the correct pronunciation of something he intended to say for a long time. I heard her say, after a pause, "You may call me Myra if you prefer." I heard him say that he did prefer it very much. The legal matter of the Aldenver inheritance took 11 months to resolve. There were competing claims from a distant cousin that had to be dismissed, trust accounts that had been absorbing interest for 2 decades that had to be unraveled, and a petition to the College of Arms that required 3 separate affidavits and a great deal of correspondence with London. I managed the greater part of it, at the Duke's direction, with the thoroughness he expected of everyone, and had apparently also come to expect of me. They were married the following August, at the small church at Thornwick, where the old vicar who had registered her birth was still in residence and wept openly throughout the ceremony, which I thought entirely appropriate, and which the Duke, for once, did not seem to mind. The church was not large. The congregation was not a glittering assembly of the county's finest. There was no orchestra, no procession of titled guests, no carriages lined up the lane to impress the neighbors. There was simply a summer morning, warm and unhurried, the smell of old stone and cut grass coming through the open windows, and a man who had spent 3 years searching for a promise he had made to a dead friend, and a woman who had spent a lifetime not knowing she was being searched for. I had drawn up the marriage settlement myself. The Duke insisted on terms that secured her independence entirely, in the event that she ever chose to exercise it, with provisions that had cost him a considerable sum to arrange, and which he had reviewed 3 times before signing to ensure nothing could be undone by legal misadventure. He told me, when I said the provisions were generous to a degree unusual even for a duke, that generous was not quite the word he would use. The word he would use, he said, was correct. I did not argue. He was right, as he generally was about such things. He took her hand at the altar with the unhurried certainty of a man who has no intention of letting go now that he has found what he was looking for. And she gave her hand with the clear, undeflected composure that was simply Myra, that calm, that directness, that refusal to be either diminished or dazzled, which had characterized her since the first morning I saw her folding linen in the lamplight, and thought simply that she was someone who did a task well. She was considerably more than that, as it turned out. I was best man, which surprised me somewhat, as the Duke was not given to sentiment, and I had not expected the designation. He told me, the morning of the wedding in the vestry, that I was the only person present at every relevant moment, and therefore the correct choice. This was, I recognized, his particular variety of warmth, practical, precise, and exactly as genuine as if he had made a speech about it, which he had not. The Haverston household received the whole thing with a goodwill that said more for them than any instruction the Duke might have given. Goss held the library door for her with a formality he had never applied to her as a laundress, and an expression of entire personal satisfaction. The housemaids who had folded linen beside her for 3 years brought her wildflowers from the estate garden and arranged them in her room, which was now the second-best suite in the east wing, and contained rather more space than she appeared to know what to do with at first. She adapted, she always adapted. She had been adapting since before she knew her own name. That is, I have come to think, the truest thing about her, not the birthmark, not the lineage, not the legal restoration of the Aldenver name, though those things were real and important, and I spent the better part of a year arranging their formal recognition. What the Duke had fallen in love with, I am certain of this, though he has never said so in those exact words, because he is not a man who says things in those exact words, was not the lost heiress. He did not know she was the lost heiress when the feeling took root in him. He fell in love with a young woman in gray wool who did a task with complete attention, and answered his questions without a single unnecessary word, and reported damp patches through the correct channels, and had been waiting, without knowing she was waiting, in the very house where he had spent 3 years searching for her. There is no neat lesson in that. I am a solicitor. I do not deal in neat lessons. I deal in evidence, and the evidence is simply this: that love, when it arrives honestly and without ambition, can live quietly in a house for years before it announces itself, and that some secrets, when they come to light, do not diminish anyone. They restore. The Duchess of Haverston does not fold linen anymore, though I am told, by Goss, who tells me everything, that she occasionally does so when she cannot sleep, because it is a thing she knows how to do well, and finding a task you can do well is, she says, a reliable comfort. The Duke, I am told, finds this entirely sensible. He would,